The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of our guests and panel members and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of any institution any member of the Nova Society is associated with. The material information presented on the Nova Society is for general information purposes only. Reproduction or dissemination for the purpose other than education is prohibited without express written consent of the Nova Society. We'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society, and today we reach into the mailbag and we're going to answer a question from one of our listeners, Frank from Virginia. He's a friend of mine and I've known him for 25 years, better known to me as T, and we are going to be talking about the recent Biden proposal for amendments to the Constitution that would impact the Supreme Court as far as term limits and rules, and about the immunity of presidents going forward. And he's wondering, first of all, what the process is, how much chance is there of getting this through, and finally, if it is gotten through, if Trump becomes president, what might happen? So, we're going to be answering T's question in today's episode, so let's listen in. Let's go to the question.
Alrighty. So we have our question of Biden's plans for reform to the Supreme Court and the immunities, and Biden has a three-point reform. The first is no immunity for crimes for a former president that former president committed in office. It's amendment called No One is Above the Law. Term limits for Supreme Court justices is number 2. And the third is a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. And the question from our listener is that all 3 points within the plan, they seem exceptionally reasonable steps to bring the government back into a lasting control that would benefit both parties and, of course, the nation in the long run. But in the short term, for the Republican Party's benefit, it would seem that preventing any of this from happening would be the better choice from their perspective. Thus, if the listener says that if I, the listener, am understanding the process correctly, this would have to pass through the Congress, which is currently Republican controlled. So the question is, what is the actual process of a plan like this follows to get successfully implemented? That's the first part. How likely is this actually to be put into effect? If this is put into effect, how likely is it that it would just be overturned under the next Republican presidency? So then part of that would be, could this be put into effect between now and the election if Trump were elected in November, let's say?
So first of all, I think, the idea that Republicans would be against this would be short-sighted on the part of Republicans if that's true. I'm not sure that I would throw it out there for a vote and see what happens rather than just assuming that they're not going to go for it. But I think that of those 3 proposals, probably legislation to state clearly that the president is not above the law, could be a real winner. I mean, that it makes so much sense. There's nothing to suggest that the Supreme Court got that one right. There's nothing in the Constitution about it. There's certainly nothing in the way that the framers created this country as a constitutional republic that says that the president is above the law. So I think that would be first. And when you think about that part, you also have to remember that the Supreme Court also basically threw out the 14th Amendment, right? Which clearly states that if you've attempted a insurrection, you are no longer eligible to run for office. I mean, you don't have to be brought up on charges of an insurrection, of starting an insurrection, to know that what we saw on January 6th was an insurrection. It culminated in that day, but it had been a long time in the works. and we don't know all the details about it. We don't know exactly what Justice Alito's role in it was going to be, but we think we know that he was planning to nullify, put the election on hold, put certification on hold, and then throw it to Congress, which is the scenario that I spoke about earlier, and that the Republicans in Congress would choose the next president. So there's a very flawed Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is one of these institutions that we really can't afford to lose. It is definitely in need of reform, because when we don't have a Supreme Court that we trust, the law suffers, the country suffers. There are other institutions as well, but this is probably the most important one. Maybe the military would be second, and then law enforcement. And we know how that goes. So I really think that those two proposals, the first two that we were speaking about, and then as far as term limits go, I mean, I think you would have to specify that it doesn't apply to this current crop, right? They took the jobs knowing that they had a lifetime appointment, but going forward, there would be a negotiated 18 years or whatever it is term that ends at some point without the person actually having to die. And the numbers, life expectancy, things like that. In 1750, I think, when this law was codified, the life expectancy was something like 40 something. Until 1970, Supreme Court judges served for 15 years. Now they're getting up to 30 years in the Supreme Court. That's a big difference. And it's hard to justify giving somebody that much power for that long a period of time. And I think it's important that we do something about that.
I agree. So first of all, shout out to the person that wrote into this. This is from Frank. He is in Virginia. He is a friend of mine. We were both gamers together. So how you doing, T? Hope the wife and the kids are doing well. So I'll take on the technical aspects of this. So the first two he's looking for a constitutional amendment, and that is by design a very difficult thing to accomplish. Number one, it has to go before the House and Senate, and 2/3 majority of each must say yes. We agree with this amendment, and then it goes to the states, and then the state houses, 3/4 of those have to approve the amendment to the Constitution. That's way number one. That's usually the most common method this is done. That's why this is so very difficult to do, to get, first of all, 2/3 of the Congress, just getting past that, the Senate and the House. You have to have some sort of supermajority to be able to make these things happen. And a supermajority has just not really been in the cards in both houses for quite some time. And then you got to go to the states, and you got to get 3/4 of them to agree up to it. And that just makes the bar very, very difficult. So going the common method that this would be done, I would say the chances are slim and none to ever getting through, because you're never going to get the Congress to 2/3 of the Congress of both houses to agree, and 3/4 of the states to go with it as we stand right now. The other method is to have a convention of states. They could completely just bypass Congress and say the states could get together, and 2/3 of the states through their legislatures could call for a national convention to amend the Constitution. Again, very complex, very cumbersome. It still requires a very mass majority of the states to undertake this and say, hey, this is an amendment of the Constitution. Never really been used because of how convoluted it is. But the fact is that it is a way that the states could come together. And one of the things that we've been talking about is the states having this rule that a bunch of states are already signed up for, that if you win the popular vote, regardless of what happens in the state, you get the state's electoral college numbers. That still hasn't reached that level. That would make a difference in for the electoral college. Again, something that probably ought to go away. And of course, then there's the 21st Amendment, which has a few things. When that was passed into, again, 2/3 of both houses Congress voted to send the amendment to the states for ratification, but instead of insisting that 3/4 of state legislatures approve the amendment, Congress specified that this article shall be inoperative unless it shall have been ratified as an amendment to the Constitution by a convention of several states. Once again, it was only done once to repeal prohibition, but it's a way we can do this. It is doable. Now, when we're talking, so that takes, the immunity, the no one is above the law amendment to the Constitution probably makes that not even a starter, although I agree with Scott. There are benefits to both parties to actually support this one. There really is something in it that says, hey, you know what? This probably isn't a bad idea, because if we give that immunity, and let's keep this in mind, the Supreme Court's ruling, Biden now has that immunity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like when I refereed football and lacrosse in the NCAA. My comment is every coach wants his unfair advantage, but there's only one thing he wants more, that the other coach doesn't have his unfair advantage. If I can't have my unfair advantage, I want a level playing field. That's the way they think. So that one there, maybe it is a good idea to throw it out there, see who votes for it, and hear the reasons why they don't want it. Are they just protecting Donald Trump, or are they thinking a little bit forward and thinking, hey, wait a minute, what if the Democrats win the next 10 presidential elections? This could be bad for us. The other one with the Constitution that probably has almost no chance is term limits for Supreme Court justices. Again, that would require a constitutional amendment. Is it a great idea? Yes, it is. But let's also remember, this is the only thing I've ever agreed with Ted Cruz on, who says he has pushed numerous times for term limits for members of the Senate, members of the House. Big proponent. It's the only thing I agree with him on. Other than, no, you can't have my hamburger, my cheeseburger, or my bacon. But other than that, the fact is that, once again, from a political standpoint, does this hurt either party? And if I'm the Republicans, I think it hurts me today. But if I look at the age of the justices on the court, and I say, okay, we're talking, I think this says 18 years. He went, after 18 years, you're off. How many of the justices, Alito, Thomas, Roberts, the three of the six conservatives, how many of them are going to live past 18 years? Not very many of them. And once they go, you better hope that you got a Republican as the president and a Republican Senate, so you can confirm 3 more justices like this. And if you don't, you could have a real quick swing to 6-3 liberal very quickly. So, this is one of the things. Once again, think a little farther beyond your own nose. Now, the last one, the Code of Conduct, that doesn't require a constitutional amendment. That does not require a constitutional amendment. However, the question is going to come of this, and here we go. The Supreme Court gets to decide it. Can one branch of government impose restrictions on another branch of government? And that will be the challenge. That the Congress is, as the legislative branch, they are co-equal branches of government. One branch cannot dictate rules to the other. And I think that would come before the Supreme Court. And I think the Supreme Court would probably say, no, it's unconstitutional, because you are trying to, We are equal branches of government. You cannot come in here and you cannot say how we have to run our house. Would it be a good idea for the Supreme Court for their legitimacy? I think it'd be a great idea. What I'd like to see is the Supreme Court sit down and say, "Hey, we're going to do this ourselves, and we're going to make this like legit. We're going to make legitimate rules as to our conduct that we're going to follow, and come up with some real legitimate penalties if they aren't. Maybe give the Chief Justice the ability to determine who should recuse themselves and who should not. Maybe put it in his hands. Maybe make it a majority kind of thing. You got 9 justices. Okay, Clarence Thomas, should you recuse yourself? 5 of the other 8 judges say you should. You're off. Well, I'm going to take the decision out of your hands. And maybe that's the way to go about it. So, again, this wouldn't require the constitutional amendment. Is it necessary? Yes. But the fact that it's going to come down to a challenge, it's guaranteed it's going to come down to a challenge because of that idea of separation of the branches of government.
If the Project 2025 and Agenda 47 and the non-certifications and the congressional determination of who the next president is, if all that happens, and it doesn't matter who the public votes for, Trump becomes the next president, then how does that affect your response to the question?
Well, at that point, there'll be only one judge, one justice, and his name will be Trump. And the rest of it won't really matter. Reading a little bit more into Project 2025, the changes that would have to be undergone in every branch of government, and in the executive branch, certainly the Congress would be sent home. That is the end of the country as we know it. And I don't think the Supreme Court would matter anymore, because they would simply also be told to just stand down, go home. We don't need you anymore. I'm going to make all the rules, and I'm going to decide what's right. And in a sense, that's what the Supreme Court has done. I mean, this Supreme Court, this John Roberts Supreme Court, has decided that the Constitution is whatever we say it is. There's no precedents, don't matter. Stare decisis doesn't matter. They can come up with all kinds of crazy things. I've been doing it for a while, right? Shelby, I thought was a really weird decision. The West Virginia versus the EPA was a very strange decision, talking about equal state sovereignty and major questions doctrine. Just the fact that they kept Trump on the ballot, to me, is a signal that they're partisan politics. They're politicians. They're not there's this idea that we always had growing up that these judges were so wise and Solomonic. They're not. They're just politicians. And the country understands. 53%, I think, of the country thinks that Thomas should be relieved of duty, but there's no way to do that without him actually just stepping down himself. And there's got to be some kind of mechanism for that.
Well, there actually is, but it's called impeachment.
Impeachment, right.
And you're never going to get that.
Yeah, right. That's not going to happen. We know that. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that, yeah. He's not getting impeached. So
if we haven't figured out that system doesn't work really well.
And again, like I just said, 53% of Americans want Thomas to step down. You look at all the percentages of what the country wants and what they're given by this government, by a Congress that represents very few people. The Supreme Court is a perfect example of that. The Supreme Court has been nominated and confirmed by less of the country than more of the country, because of the way the Electoral College works and the way that proportionment in the House and all kinds of stuff like that. We don't really have representation in the government anymore, and somehow or another we've got to learn how to fight back the way they fight. And I don't mean sticks and stones here. I'm talking about ideas and legislative victories on the state level, all the way up, and make sure that this is not, we're not being abused by the people that we elect, and the people who are then nominated and confirmed by those people that we elected. So it's the country in some senses, it has been in a bad place for some time now, and I understand that it's backlash against the 60s and 70s, and that the Supreme Court is part of that, and Project 2025 is part of that. But it's very much a scary place when you think about where this could all lead to, and it's not very democratic.
And it is a matter of people that represent states who have a very small electoral college stake are very, very prominent. Tom Cotton from Arkansas, Josh Hawley from Missouri, Mike Lee from Utah, Chuck Grassley, Iowa, John Kennedy from Louisiana, Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. Even on the Democrat side, you've got Peter Welch from Vermont, Mazie Hirono from Hawaii, Delaware is represented, Minnesota is represented, Rhode Island is represented. And, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be represented, but when you look at it, we are a country that is controlled by land, not by population. In the original founding fathers, when it came down to the Electoral College and figuring out how to do all this so that all states had a legitimate say, that they were truly equal. That condition has been gone for many, many years, for decades, if not a century or more. Once the United States had expanded out across the continent, and the population began to move, let's remember, California one time was an afterthought. That wasn't until the mid-19th century that they came in, and now they're the most populous state in the Union. New York was always one of the most populous states. Now it's not. Texas was always one of the most. Now it's Florida is right up there. So, when you start looking at this and you start understanding that the idea of the Electoral College, and I know that Chris Christie said, well, the Electoral College changes all the time because people move from one state to another. That changes the number of delegates you get, blah, 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 blah. That still does not negate the fact that what we do today, if you're in California, your vote is like, I think Scott brought it out, compared to somebody in Wyoming, like 37 times less valuable. I think that was one of the numbers that Scott brought out. I can't remember right off the top of my head because it was like middle of last year. But your vote just doesn't count as much. I'm sorry. Your representatives, you have the most representatives, 54, 55. But Wyoming has 3 of a population that's major cities in California, in Texas, in South Carolina have more population. And I'm not picking on poor Wyoming. I'm not. But the fact is that you don't have the population, but your vote counts more. Your congressman vote counts more. You get 2 senators.
Right. And there's an electoral minimum of 3, right?
Right.
So even though you have no population, you still get 3 electoral college votes. And that's simply not fair anymore because we've got these empty states that have all this clout. Look, just getting back to the Supreme Court for a second. Article 3, Section 1 says the judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior. And the word behavior is spelled with a capital B. And it's clear that this court does not. I mean, these are corrupt men, and something needs to be done about it. Alito and Thomas have gotten millions of dollars in gifts and benefits from people who appear in front of them or their interests appear in front of them. That is Venezuela politics. That is not U.S. politics. And it's frankly, it's crazy. There's got to be something to be done about this. And look, let's, I would throw it out there and see what happens, understanding that that if Kamala Harris becomes president, she's going to push for this, right? And that, after Trump, assuming he loses, if he loses, I should say, there's not going to be a Republic. The Republicans don't have a great bench, and their next candidate is not going to be a great candidate. And the losing streak really might go on for a while, I think, as you've indicated, Mark. And it's in everybody's best interest in this country to make sure that the president is on the level and make sure the courts are on the level, and that they're accountable in some way, accountable. And, look, that alone is worth voting for Kamala Harris. She can start going out there today, if she hasn't already, saying, look, we need to reform the Supreme Court. And everybody agrees with it. And we need to do something about it. And that could be a big game changer for her in this election.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, the Phoenix Research Group, an independent research consortium offering social issue solutions to NGOs and international government agencies through multidisciplinary, nonpartisan, and unbiased research. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, Podkite, who does all our analytics, iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source of music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershworth, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.